"I'm sorry, Selwyn, but we've decided not to escalate your complaint." Orrin from HR didn't even pretend to sound sorry as he slid my printed statement back across the table like it was garbage he couldn't wait to throw away. The fluorescent light above us flickered and buzzed, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as he added the words that would haunt me for weeks. "We found no evidence of harassment. You must have misinterpreted Corvin's enthusiasm." Enthusiasm. That was the actual word he chose. For a man who cornered me in the supply hallway until I had to squeeze past him just to escape. For the way his hand had brushed my waist and lingered there far too long while he whispered comments about my body. For his habit of blocking doorways with that predatory smirk, forcing me to ask permission to leave. For the constant touches, the inappropriate compliments, the way he made me feel hunted in my own workplace. And now HR, the department that was supposed to protect employees like me, was calling it enthusiasm, telling me I'd imagined it or blown harmless friendliness out of proportion. My throat tightened until I could barely breathe. The humiliation burned hotter than any anger I'd ever felt. I had followed every single step of the company's harassment policy. I'd documented dates, times, witnesses, specific quotes. I'd written everything in clear, professional language without emotion or exaggeration. I'd done exactly what they told us to do in the training videos and employee handbooks, and they were still choosing him over me. Orrin leaned back in his chair, looking bored and impatient, already reaching for the next file on his cluttered desk like I was just another inconvenient task he needed to check off his list. I wasn't worth even 5 more minutes of his time. "Let's not make this bigger than it is," he said dismissively, not bothering to make eye contact as he essentially told me to shut up and go away. I stood up on legs that felt like they might collapse, gathered my rejected paperwork with hands that shook visibly, and walked out of his office before the tears could start. The moment I stepped into the hallway, my vision blurred. I made it to the emergency stairwell just barely, pushed through the heavy door, and collapsed onto the concrete steps. My whole body was shaking. A coworker named Vesper from accounting appeared at the top of the stairs, saw me sitting there crying, and quickly turned around and walked away without saying a word. She was too afraid to even acknowledge what she'd witnessed. My name is Selwyn Hart, and for most of my life, I've been the person who doesn't cause trouble or make waves or create conflict. I'm the employee who stays late when others go home early, who takes the worst shifts without complaining, who remembers everyone's coffee order because I understand what it feels like to be overlooked and invisible. I don't start fights. I don't create drama. I don't push back when people are rude or dismissive. And maybe that's exactly why they thought I'd let this go, that I'd swallow my discomfort and fear the same way I've swallowed every inappropriate joke, every time someone talked over me in meetings, every moment I've been treated like I don't matter. I was 26 years old, living alone in a studio apartment I could barely afford, with no family support or safety net to catch me if I fell. This job was everything: my rent, my food, my health insurance, my entire survival. Losing it would mean losing the life I'd worked so hard to build from nothing. But sitting in that cold stairwell, holding my rejected complaint in trembling hands, something inside me broke cleanly and precisely. I looked at those papers and thought about how they dismissed me, protected him, made me feel like I was crazy. And I decided, I'm not letting this go. Not this time. Not ever. The nightmare had started 6 weeks earlier on a quiet Tuesday evening when I'd stayed late to finish a project deadline. Most of the office had cleared out by 6:30, leaving just a few of us scattered across the dim, after-hours workspace. I'd gone to the supply room to grab fresh printer paper when Corvin suddenly appeared in the doorway behind me, blocking my only exit. He stood too close in that narrow space between the metal shelving units, invading the boundaries of personal space in a way that made my skin crawl immediately. "Working late again, Selwyn," he'd said, his voice low and intimate in a way that felt predatory rather than friendly. "You're always so dedicated and hardworking. I really admire that about you. You're special." I'd tried to edge past him, but he'd deliberately stepped sideways, still blocking my path out of the small room. His hand had reached out and touched my shoulder, then slowly slid down my arm in a deliberate caress that made my stomach turn. "You know, you're always so tense and serious. You should learn to relax more. Maybe let me help you unwind sometime." I'd pulled away sharply, my heart racing with fear. Please move, I'd said, keeping my voice as steady as possible. I need to get back to my desk right now. He'd smiled then, not friendly, but predatory, before finally stepping aside just enough for me to squeeze past. Relax, he'd called after me. It's a compliment. You should learn how to take them better. After that first incident, I'd started noticing how my coworkers reacted to Corvin's behavior toward me. Or more accurately, how they carefully didn't react at all. In team meetings, he'd make comments about my appearance that left me feeling exposed and uncomfortable, and people would either laugh nervously or suddenly become very interested in their laptops, pretending they hadn't heard anything problematic. Selwyn's looking especially beautiful today, he'd announce in front of everyone, his eyes moving over my body in a way that felt violating. That color really flatters your figure. Doesn't she look amazing, everyone? Some people would nod uncomfortably and mumble agreement. Others would stare at their screens intensely. Nobody ever said anything to stop him or acknowledge how inappropriate his comments were. He was popular in the office, charismatic, funny, the guy who organized happy hours and remembered birthdays and always knew the right jokes to tell. I wasn't popular. I was quiet, kept to myself, didn't have a social circle at work who would defend me or speak up on my behalf. The power dynamics were painfully clear. He mattered to people, and I didn't. When I'd visibly recoil from his attention or move away from him, Taylor from my team would roll his eyes in obvious annoyance. Lighten up, Selwyn, he'd said once when I'd changed seats to avoid sitting next to Corvin at lunch. He's just being friendly and nice. Not everything is some kind of attack or harassment. But it didn't feel friendly. It felt dangerous. The comments continued and escalated steadily over the following weeks. Corvin started calling me his favorite shy one during meetings, like I was a pet or possession rather than a colleague. A few people would giggle uncomfortably at the nickname. I would freeze completely, my face burning with humiliation, unable to respond without seeming oversensitive or unable to take a joke. She's just so adorable when she gets embarrassed, he'd say with that smile, and more nervous laughter would ripple through the room like permission. I felt trapped by my own professionalism and fear, trapped by the need to be seen as a team player who could handle workplace banter, trapped by the knowledge that any reaction would be judged harshly and used against me. One afternoon, as a meeting ended, Corvin deliberately brushed against me as he walked past my chair, his hand landing on my shoulder and squeezing meaningfully before slowly sliding down my arm. Great contributions today, Selwyn, he'd said, his touch lingering far too long before he finally moved on. My entire body had tensed involuntarily at his unwanted touch. I'd wanted to scream at him to stop touching me, to leave me alone, to treat me like a professional colleague instead of whatever this was. But I just sat there frozen, feeling everyone's eyes on me, knowing any reaction would somehow be my fault. After that meeting, I'd finally decided I couldn't handle this alone anymore. I needed to report it officially and get HR involved to make it stop through proper channels. So I'd carefully prepared my documentation and made an appointment with Oren. My first visit to Oren's office had been exactly 2 weeks before the rejection that sent me to that stairwell. I'd arrived prepared with a typed document listing every single incident with precise dates, times, locations, and witness names when available. I'd kept my language completely factual and unemotional, describing exactly what happened without adding my feelings or interpretations. Oren had listened while I spoke, nodding occasionally, taking a few brief notes on his yellow legal pad. This is certainly concerning, he'd said when I finished, his tone appropriately serious and professional. We definitely take harassment allegations very seriously here at this company. I'll need some time to look into this thoroughly and speak with relevant people. Give me about a week to investigate properly, and I'll get back to you with next steps and findings. I'd left that first meeting feeling genuinely hopeful for the first time in weeks. Finally, someone in authority was taking my concerns seriously. Finally, the system was working the way it was supposed to work. Finally, I'd be protected and safe. But 3 days later, I'd walked into the break room and seen Oren and Corvin standing close together, talking in low voices and laughing about something. When Corvin had spotted me entering, he'd said something to Oren that made them both glance in my direction. Then they'd both laughed again, clearly amused. My stomach had dropped like a stone. That casual camaraderie between them told me everything about whose side Oren was really on. But I'd tried to convince myself I was being paranoid and reading too much into an innocent interaction. After I'd officially filed the complaint, Corvin's behavior had actually gotten worse rather than better, like he was deliberately testing boundaries to see what he could get away with now that HR was supposedly investigating. One morning, I'd been standing at the copy machine waiting for my documents when he'd suddenly appeared directly behind me, standing so close I could feel his breath on the back of my neck. Still holding a grudge against me. He'd whispered softly, his voice intimate and threatening at the same time. I'd spun around quickly, my heart pounding with fear, and found him standing there with his arms crossed casually, completely blocking my path away from the machine. "Excuse me," I'd said, trying desperately to keep my voice from shaking. "I need to get past you right now." He'd smiled slowly and deliberately, taking his sweet time before finally stepping aside just enough for me to squeeze by. "You're always in such a hurry to get away from me, Selwyn. We should grab coffee together sometime. Just the two of us. Clear the air and talk things through." "No, thank you," I'd managed to say firmly, slipping past him as quickly as possible and practically running back to the safety of my desk. My hands had been shaking so violently I'd barely been able to hold the papers I'd just printed. Across the open office space, I'd seen Garrick from IT watching the entire interaction, but he'd quickly looked away and pretended to be absorbed in his work when our eyes met. He'd witnessed everything. He knew exactly what was happening, but like everyone else, he'd chosen silence and complicity over speaking up. That's when I'd gone back to HR for a second time, feeling more desperate and frightened now, hoping that reporting the escalation would finally make them take real action to protect me. Oren had looked genuinely annoyed when I'd appeared in his office doorway asking if he had a few minutes to talk. "Selwyn, I'm actually quite busy with other matters right now," he'd said, staring at his computer screen instead of looking at me. "Can this possibly wait until later in the week?" "It's about my harassment complaint," I'd said, my voice small. "The situation has gotten significantly worse since I reported it." He'd sighed heavily, like I was the unreasonable one, like I was being difficult and demanding for no good reason. "Fine, come in then, but I really only have about 5 minutes to spare." I'd quickly described the copy machine incident, the continued inappropriate comments, the way Corvin seemed emboldened rather than warned off by my complaint. Oren had actually interrupted me before I could finish my account. "Selwyn, I've looked carefully into your complaint. Multiple people have told me that Corvin is just a naturally friendly and outgoing person. You seem to be misinterpreting completely normal workplace friendliness as something inappropriate or sinister." Then he delivered the line that had made my blood run cold. "Actually, Corvin has mentioned to me that you make him uncomfortable. He says you've been acting strangely around him, and frankly, he's concerned about your behavior and mental stability." They'd flipped the entire narrative, made me the problem, turned my legitimate complaint into evidence of my instability. I'd left that second meeting feeling utterly defeated and powerless. Oren had scheduled the formal rejection meeting for the following week, but I'd already known exactly how it would end. That night, I'd gone home to my tiny studio apartment and completely broken down. I'd cried harder than I'd cried in years, feeling trapped and helpless and completely alone in the world. They'd chosen to protect him. They'd labeled me as the problem, and there was absolutely nothing I could do about it without risking my job, my income, my entire ability to survive. But as I'd sat there surrounded by crumpled tissues, looking through the paperwork Oren had given me during our meeting, the official harassment policy, the form confirming my complaint had been filed, I'd noticed something small. At the very bottom of one page, printed in tiny gray text, was a web address, an internal HR portal for complaint tracking and documentation. I'd never heard anyone mention this portal before. It wasn't in any training materials I'd received. Out of pure curiosity, I'd pulled out my laptop and carefully typed in the address. It had brought me to a login page requiring employee credentials. I'd entered my regular work username and password, not really expecting it to work, but surprisingly it had. Suddenly I was looking at an internal system I'd never known existed. A system filled with documents and files that regular employees weren't supposed to access. And there, in a list of recent activity highlighted in red, I'd seen my own name with a flag icon next to it. My heart had started racing as I'd clicked on the flagged document next to my name. The system had hesitated for a long moment, and I genuinely thought my access would be denied, that I'd triggered some kind of security alert that would get me in trouble. But then the document had suddenly loaded, filling my screen with information that made my hands go completely numb. It was an internal HR behavior summary document, the type used for tracking employee complaints and disciplinary incidents. My name was clearly listed at the top, but this wasn't my harassment complaint about Corvin. This was something entirely different, something worse. Incident report, employee Selwyn Hart, the header read in bold text. Filed by Corvin Thane. Date, exactly 2 days after I'd first reported him to Orrin. Nature of complaint, inappropriate workplace behavior toward colleague, unwanted personal contact initiated by employee, signs of emotional instability and concerning fixation. I'd stared at that screen for what felt like hours, my brain struggling desperately to process what I was reading. Corvin had filed a formal complaint against me. He'd accused me of doing exactly what he'd been doing, initiating inappropriate contact, behaving unprofessionally, being emotionally unstable. And below his detailed complaint, there was Orrin's official assessment typed in neat professional language. Complaint appears highly credible based on interview with complainant. Employee Hart has exhibited concerning behavior patterns consistent with described issues. Recommend close monitoring of situation and thorough documentation of any future incidents for potential disciplinary action. The floor had dropped out from beneath me. This was why Orrin had been so dismissive, so quick to protect Corvin, so willing to paint me as the problem. I'd continued sitting there in my apartment, staring at that damning screen, feeling like I was falling through empty space with nothing to grab onto. My harassment complaint hadn't been ignored because they couldn't find evidence or because witnesses didn't corroborate my story. It had been deliberately buried and undermined because Corvin had gotten ahead of it by filing his own false complaint first, successfully painting me as an unstable employee with boundary issues. Everything suddenly made horrible sense. Orrin's dismissiveness during our meetings, his comment about me making Corvin uncomfortable, the way he'd framed all my legitimate concerns as overreaction and paranoia. He'd accepted Corvin's false narrative without any real investigation and used it as justification to discredit everything I'd reported. I'd scrolled further through the document with shaking hands and found even more damaging information. Detailed timestamps showed that Corvin had filed his complaint exactly 48 hours after I'd first spoken privately with Orrin about the harassment, which meant Orrin had told Corvin about my complaint almost immediately, giving him advance warning and time to file a preemptive countercomplaint. That was a clear violation of confidentiality protocols. That was retaliation. That was exactly the kind of misconduct that could destroy an HR department's credibility and expose the company to serious legal liability. I'd kept scrolling and found more evidence. Internal notes from Orrin about managing my complaint carefully, comments describing me as oversensitive and potentially unreliable as a witness, references to keeping Corvin fully informed of developments so he could adequately protect himself from false accusations. It was all documented right there in the company's own system. The full realization had hit me like freezing water. My harassment complaint hadn't just been dismissed through incompetence or bias. It had been actively and deliberately undermined by people who were supposed to protect me. Orrin hadn't conducted any kind of impartial investigation. He'd immediately warned Corvin, helped him construct a defensive counter-narrative, and then used that manufactured narrative to discredit me and protect the harasser. This wasn't just failure. This was coordinated betrayal. I'd started frantically taking screenshots of everything I could find. Every document, every internal note, every timestamp, every piece of evidence. I'd saved them all to a secure folder on my personal laptop, then emailed copies to my personal email address as additional backup. My hands had been shaking so badly I'd mistyped my password 3 times before finally getting it right. But I'd been methodical and thorough, making absolutely sure I had complete copies of everything before someone realized I'd accessed the system and locked me out. As I'd reviewed all the documents more carefully with a critical eye, I'd noticed something else that seemed significant. The timestamps on Oren's communications with Corvin were suspiciously and impossibly fast. I'd filed my confidential harassment complaint at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. Oren's first documented note about discussing the sensitive situation with Corvin was timestamped for 4:15 the exact same day. Less than 2 hours. He'd contacted the accused harasser less than 2 hours after I'd filed a supposedly confidential complaint. That wasn't proper procedure. That wasn't company policy. That was protection and collusion. After that discovery, something fundamental changed inside me. The helpless despair I'd been feeling was completely replaced by cold, focused, crystal-clear determination. I had real evidence now. Not just my word against theirs, but actual hard documentation from the company's own internal system showing exactly what they'd done and how they'd done it. I'd spent that entire night going through company policies, HR procedures, employment law websites, and legal resources. I'd learned about retaliation, about confidentiality violations, about the legal responsibilities HR departments have to conduct truly impartial investigations. Oren had violated every single one of those fundamental responsibilities. The next morning, I'd gone to work with a clear plan firmly in mind. I wouldn't confront Oren or Corvin directly. I wouldn't tell any coworkers what I'd discovered. I would stay perfectly calm and professional on the surface while I figured out my next strategic move. During my lunch break, I'd carefully searched the company intranet and found the corporate HR contact portal, a completely separate system from the local office HR, specifically designed for escalating serious complaints that weren't being handled appropriately at the local level. It was buried deep in the intranet structure, probably deliberately hidden, but I'd eventually found it through persistent searching. The portal had offered an anonymous submission option specifically for ethics and compliance concerns. I'd composed a detailed but professional message explaining everything: the harassment, the complaint, the retaliation, the coordinated response between Oren and Corvin, the confidentiality breaches. I'd attached all my screenshots as supporting evidence. Then I'd scheduled a confidential callback for later that week. My finger had hovered over the submit button for a long moment while I considered the implications. Then I'd pressed it firmly. No going back now. Within just 3 hours, I'd received a response in my personal email account, fast enough to tell me that someone at corporate had actually read my submission carefully and recognized its serious nature. "Dear employee," the message had read, using the anonymous designation I'd selected in the portal. "We have received and reviewed your ethics complaint along with the attached documentation. Multiple serious inconsistencies and policy violations have been identified in the handling of your harassment report. We would like to schedule a confidential phone call to discuss this matter in greater detail. Please use the secure link below to select a time when you can speak privately without being overheard." The message had included a link to an encrypted scheduling system. I'd selected a time slot for the following day during my lunch hour, when I could leave the office building and take the call from my car in the parking garage where no one could possibly overhear our conversation. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I'd felt something resembling hope. Corporate HR had immediately flagged the serious issues. They'd recognized the same problems I'd seen. They were taking it seriously in a way Oren had never taken me seriously. That evening, I'd practiced what I would say during the upcoming call, rehearsing my story repeatedly until I could tell it calmly and clearly without getting emotional or breaking down. I'd organized all my evidence into a logical sequence: the original harassment documentation, the screenshots from the internal system, the detailed timeline showing how quickly Oren had breached confidentiality. I was prepared and ready. When I spoke to corporate, my voice would be steady and professional. The call had come the next day at exactly the scheduled time. A woman named Kendra from corporate HR had introduced herself first, along with someone from the company's legal compliance department named Tobias. Both had sounded professional but genuinely concerned. "Thank you so much for bringing this serious matter to our attention," Kendra had said warmly. "We've already reviewed the extensive documentation you submitted, and we have significant concerns about how your harassment complaint was handled at the local office level. Can you please walk us through everything that happened from your perspective?" So I told them the complete story. starting from that first incident in the supply room, moving systematically through the escalating harassment, describing my attempts to report it properly, and how those attempts had been dismissed and turned against me. I'd kept my voice steady throughout, sticking strictly to facts, letting the clear timeline speak for itself. When I'd finished, there had been a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Then Kendra had spoken, and she'd sounded genuinely shocked and angry. This is completely and utterly unacceptable on every level. The violations of proper procedure here are extensive and serious. Confidentiality breaches, failure to conduct any kind of impartial investigation, possible retaliation against a complainant, and all of it clearly documented in the company's own internal system where anyone assumed no one would look. Do you have secure copies of all the evidence you referenced in your complaint? Tobias had asked directly. Yes, I'd replied firmly. I can send everything through whatever secure channel you prefer. Please do that immediately, he'd said. And Selwyn, I'm using your real name now because we're moving forward with an official investigation. We need to take swift action on this. We'll work quietly and discreetly so we don't alert the people involved or give them opportunity to destroy evidence. Can you continue working normally while we conduct a thorough investigation? Yes, I'd said, and I genuinely meant it. I can definitely do that. Over the next week, corporate had worked incredibly quickly, but maintained complete discretion. They'd quietly requested access to attendance logs, complaint histories, internal HR communications, and email records without telling anyone at the local office why they needed the information or what they were investigating. I'd watched the tension steadily build throughout the office as people had sensed something significant was happening, but couldn't figure out what. The atmosphere had grown thick with unspoken anxiety and speculation. Oren had seemed more stressed than usual, snapping at people over minor issues and spending long periods behind his closed office door on hushed phone calls. Corvin had started acting strangely different around me. He'd suddenly stopped making any comments about my appearance. He'd given me appropriate space at meetings instead of sitting too close. He'd been polite and coldly professional in a way he'd never been before. It was like some primitive survival instinct was warning him to back off and behave normally. But it was far too late for that strategy to help him. The investigation was already well underway, gaining momentum, and being nice now wasn't going to erase months of documented harassment or the clear evidence of how HR had systematically failed to protect me. I'd kept my head down, completed my work assignments, and waited patiently. Every single day. I'd half expected someone to call me into a meeting and tell me what was happening, but corporate had specifically said they'd conduct their investigation without involving me directly until they were ready to take final action. So I'd waited, continuing to document everything that happened, staying alert and ready for whatever came next. Then one afternoon, without any warning, Oren had suddenly appeared at my desk, his face flushed red and his movements jerky with obvious anxiety. Selwyn, I need to see you in my office immediately. Right now. My heart had started pounding hard, but I'd followed him calmly down the hallway, keeping my expression carefully neutral and unreadable. Once we were in his office with the door firmly closed, he turned on me with surprising intensity and aggression. Have you spoken to anyone outside this local office about your harassment complaint? He demanded, his voice rising. Anyone at all, corporate HR, legal department, external lawyers, anyone. I'd looked at him steadily, keeping my face completely blank. About what specifically? I'd asked with deliberate innocence. About your harassment complaint, he'd said, practically shouting now. About the conversations you and I have had, about any of this situation. You told me the complaint was officially closed. I'd reminded him calmly, keeping my voice level. You said there was no evidence and that I'd misinterpreted normal workplace friendliness. So no, I haven't talked to anyone about a closed complaint that you resolved. It wasn't technically a lie. I hadn't talked to anyone. I'd used an anonymous digital submission system, but Oren had clearly known something was seriously wrong. His hands had been trembling visibly, and there was sweat beading on his forehead despite the office air conditioning running. If you filed any additional complaints or contacted anyone outside this office about this matter, you need to tell me right now, he'd said, leaning forward aggressively across his desk. This is extremely serious. Before I could respond, there had been a sharp knock on his office door. Oren had called out, not now, but the door had opened anyway. Two people I'd never seen before, both wearing corporate headquarters badges, had walked in purposefully. "Mr. Oren," one of them had said formally, "we're from corporate HR and legal compliance. We need to speak with you immediately regarding serious allegations." What followed over the next 2 days had been intense and swift. Corporate had conducted mandatory interviews with Oren, Corvin, and several of my coworkers who'd witnessed various incidents. People had been called into the main conference room one by one, emerging looking confused, worried, and unsettled. Anxious whispers had rippled constantly through the office. Something major was clearly happening, but no one knew exactly what or who was involved. I'd been asked to join a private closed-door session with Kendra and Tobias on the second day of interviews. They'd been professional but kind, asking me to verify specific details, to confirm exact dates and times, to explain how certain incidents had made me feel and why. "We need your direct personal testimony to complete our investigation properly," Kendra had explained carefully. "Everything you told us initially has been thoroughly corroborated by evidence in the HR system and by multiple witness statements, but we need you to go on the official record." So I had. I'd given them a formal sworn statement, signed official documentation, and answered every single question they'd asked with complete honesty. Near the end of the long interview, Tobias had said something that had made my breath catch in my throat. "Selwyn, I want you to know that what happened to you represents a serious systemic failure at multiple organizational levels. This isn't just about one harassment complaint being mishandled. As we've investigated deeper, we've discovered this isn't the first time complaints about Corvin have been filed and then dismissed by Oren. There's a clear pattern here that goes back years. Multiple complaints, other victims, other women he'd harassed. And Oren had protected him every single time by burying their complaints. During that same extensive interview, corporate had revealed the truly shocking full scope of what their investigation had uncovered. It was significantly worse than even I had imagined. There have been 3 previous harassment complaints formally filed against Corvin over the past 2 years, Kendra had told me, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. All 3 were dismissed by Oren after minimal or no actual investigation. In 2 of those cases, the complainants left the company within months of their complaints being rejected. We strongly believe they felt they had absolutely no other option but to leave. She'd shown me carefully redacted versions of those previous complaints, with names removed for privacy protection, but with details that were horrifyingly, sickeningly familiar. The exact same pattern of unwanted touching and inappropriate comments. The same use of friendliness as cover for harassment. The same complaints about Oren dismissing their concerns and immediately protecting Corvin. We also found extensive evidence that Oren has been selectively and deliberately documenting incidents to build false cases against people who dared to complain, Tobias had added grimly. He's been systematically creating misleading narratives to discredit victims, exactly like he did with you. This represents systematic misconduct at the highest level. I'd felt vindicated but also physically sick. How many other people had gone through exactly what I'd gone through? How many had left this company broken and defeated, believing they were the problem? "We're taking immediate action," Kendra had assured me firmly. "There will be a mandatory all-staff meeting tomorrow morning. We want you to be present, but you don't have to participate actively or speak if you're not comfortable. Just be there to witness." The meeting had been scheduled for 9 o'clock. I'd barely slept that night. The all-hands meeting had completely filled the largest conference room in the entire building. Every single employee had been required to attend without exception, with corporate representatives standing formally at the front and local HR staff sitting nervously off to the side. Oren had looked like he might physically faint at any moment, his face pale and drawn, his hands shaking visibly. Corvin had sat with his arms crossed defensively, his expression furious and indignant, like he genuinely couldn't believe this was happening to him. I'd found a seat in the very back corner, trying to stay invisible and unnoticed one last time. Kendra had stood at the front podium, her expression grave and serious. "Thank you all for coming on short notice. We need to address some extremely serious matters regarding workplace conduct and major policy violations that have recently come to our attention. Over the past week, corporate HR has conducted an intensive investigation into complaint handling procedures at this location. We've uncovered serious breaches of protocol, multiple confidentiality violations, and significant ethical failures. The room had gone completely, utterly silent. People had started glancing around nervously, trying to figure out what this was about and who was involved. We take workplace harassment extremely seriously, Kendra had continued firmly. When employees come forward with complaints, they must be heard, believed, protected, and supported through a fair and impartial investigation process. That absolutely did not happen here. Multiple employees over multiple years have had their legitimate complaints dismissed or actively undermined by local HR management. More nervous glances around the packed room. Some people had started looking directly at Oren, whose face had grown progressively redder. "Effective immediately," Kendra had said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "The following actions are being taken. Mr. Corvin Thane is being terminated for workplace misconduct and deliberate dishonesty in HR filings," Kendra had announced clearly. The room had erupted in shocked gasps and whispers. People had turned to stare at Corvin, whose expression had transformed from angry to stunned. "This decision is effective immediately and is absolutely final. Mr. Thane, you'll need to collect your personal belongings under direct supervision and exit the building today." Corvin had stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is completely ridiculous," he'd shouted. "You can't just, I have rights. This is all based on lies from an unstable. Mr. Thane, you'll have the opportunity to review all evidence and file any disputes through proper legal channels." Tobias had interrupted calmly, but firmly. "But your employment with this company is terminated as of this exact moment. Building security will escort you from the premises immediately." 2 security guards had appeared at the conference room door as if on cue, and Corvin had looked around wildly, like he expected someone to defend him or protest this obvious injustice. But no one had said anything at all. The people who'd laughed at his jokes and called him a great guy and dismissed my concerns, they'd all just sat there in complete silence, watching him be escorted out like a criminal. I'd sat in my corner seat with my hands clasped tightly in my lap, my heart pounding so hard I'd thought everyone in the room could hear it. After months of being dismissed and disbelieved, and made to feel like I was crazy or oversensitive, real justice was finally happening. Kendra had waited for the door to close firmly behind Corvin before continuing. I'd known what was coming next. "Additionally," Kendra had continued, turning her attention directly to Oren, who looked like he desperately wanted to disappear into the floor. "Mr. Oren Chastain is being terminated for failure to properly investigate harassment complaints, multiple breaches of confidentiality, retaliation against complainants, and deliberate falsification of HR documents." The room had been absolutely silent this time. No gasps, just heavy, shocked silence as the weight of those accusations settled over everyone. "This decision is also effective immediately," Kendra had stated firmly. "Mr. Chastain's failures represent a fundamental and complete breach of the trust placed in HR personnel. His actions have created an unsafe work environment and violated both company policy and legal requirements." Oren had stood up slowly, his face completely drained of all color. "I was just following standard procedures," he'd said weakly, his voice barely audible. "I was trying to manage competing complaints fairly. You were protecting a known harasser and building false cases against his victims." Tobias had cut him off sharply. "We have extensive and undeniable documentation of your actions. There will be a full review process available to you, but your employment is terminated as of today." Oren had walked out of the conference room like a ghost, his shoulders slumped in defeat, his entire career destroyed by his own documented misconduct. I'd watched him leave, and all I'd felt was a strange numbness mixed with profound relief. These were the 2 people who'd made my life absolute hell for months, and now they were gone, finished. The room had remained completely silent for a long moment after Oren left. Then Kendra had cleared her throat and said, "We have one more announcement." Everyone turned to look at her, and I felt my heart skip a beat. "Before we conclude this meeting," Kendra had said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "I want to address something important. When employees come forward with concerns about harassment or misconduct, they take an enormous risk. They risk their jobs, their reputations, their sense of safety. And when the system fails them, as it failed Ms. Hart, we don't just lose their trust. We lose our integrity as an organization. She looked directly at me then, and I'd felt my face flush with everyone's attention suddenly focused on me. Ms. Hart showed exceptional courage in bringing these issues forward despite facing dismissal and retaliation. Because of her persistence and thorough documentation, we were able to uncover systemic problems that had been harming employees for years. She didn't just save herself, she helped protect future employees from experiencing the same failures. Kendra had paused, letting those words sink in. Corporate has created a new position, Administrative Compliance Specialist focused on employee advocacy and HR oversight. This role will work directly with our HR teams to ensure proper complaint handling, conduct regular policy audits, and serve as a confidential resource for employees who feel their concerns aren't being addressed appropriately. She'd smiled at me. Ms. Hart, we'd like to offer you this position. It comes with a significant salary increase, comprehensive benefits, better hours, and the authority to implement real change. You've proven you have the integrity, attention to detail, and courage this role requires. I'd sat there frozen, unable to process what I was hearing. A promotion, after everything I'd been through. You don't need to answer right now, Tobias had added gently, but we hope you'll consider it. I'd found my voice finally, though it shook slightly. I accept, I'd said. I don't need time to think about it. I accept. The room had erupted in applause then, and I'd seen genuine smiles on my coworkers' faces. Relief, respect, maybe even a little bit of hope that things were actually going to change. As the meeting ended and people filed out, several colleagues had stopped to shake my hand or squeeze my shoulder, offering quiet words of support and apology for not speaking up sooner. Vesper had hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you for being brave enough for all of us." 3 months later, I sat in my new office. A real office with solid walls, a locking door, and a window that overlooked the city instead of a parking lot. The nameplate on my door read, Selwyn Hart, Administrative Compliance Specialist. And every time I saw it, I felt a surge of something I'd never quite felt before at work. Pride. My morning had been spent reviewing the new harassment reporting protocols I'd helped design. Protocols that ensured complaints went directly to corporate oversight instead of potentially compromised local HR. My afternoon was dedicated to training sessions, teaching employees how to document concerns and navigate the system without fear. Everything had changed. The people who dismissed and harassed me were gone. The broken system that had failed me had been rebuilt with proper safeguards and accountability. And I had a direct role in making sure no one else would ever have to experience what I'd experienced. Sometimes I walked past Corvin's old desk, now occupied by a quiet woman from accounting, and felt something I couldn't quite name. Not satisfaction exactly, but something like closure. He thought he could harass me without consequences because that's how it had always worked before. Orrin had thought he could protect harassers and punish victims because no one had ever held him accountable. They'd both been catastrophically wrong. I hadn't screamed or made dramatic scenes or sought petty revenge. I'd simply documented everything methodically, stayed calm and professional, and let the truth reveal itself through their own system. Their arrogance, their certainty that no one was watching, that I was too weak to fight back, had created the very evidence that destroyed them. As I locked my office door at the end of that day, I took a deep breath and let myself feel everything I'd been holding back for so long. Relief that the nightmare was over. Pride that I'd stood up for myself. Vindication that I'd been right all along. But also a deep sadness for everyone who'd gone through this before me and hadn't had the documentation or resources or sheer stubborn persistence to fight back successfully. My phone buzzed with a message from Kendra. Excellent presentation today. The new protocols are already making a difference. Thank you for everything you do. I smiled and slipped my phone into my bag. This was what real justice looked like. Not dramatic or cinematic, but quiet and thorough and built on documentation and truth. HR had ignored me. People had dismissed me. But the system, when used correctly, when evidence was undeniable, had ultimately worked. And now I had the power to make sure that when the next person came forward with a harassment complaint, they'd be heard, believed, protected, and supported the way I should have been from the very start. I wasn't too sensitive. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't misinterpreting friendliness. I'd been right. And now I was using that experience to build something better. As I walked to my car, I thought about that moment in the stairwell months ago when I'd felt completely powerless and alone. If I could go back and tell that version of myself anything, it would be this: document everything. Stay calm. Trust that the truth is stronger than lies. And never, ever let anyone convince you that your experience doesn't matter, because it does. And sometimes, one person's courage to stand up and demand better can change an entire system.